Welcome to the Keep 'em Coming Back Rethinking Volunteer Retention Training. My name is Lily, and I am ACFBN's Agency Training Coordinator. Today, we are very excited to have Beth Steinhorn speaking with us for a second time. As president of VQ Strategy, Beth partners with organizations to increase impact through strategic and innovative engagement. She is the author of multiple books and articles and is part of the national conversation about strategic engagement. Beth also consults with organizations throughout the US and Canada, so we are very, very happy to have her here for a second time with us. Just a few quick reminders, there will be time for Q&A at the end of the session, but please, throughout the presentation, if you have a question, please put it down in the chat box and we'll get to it. Lastly, just as a courtesy to everyone who's speaking, we ask that you please mute your microphones. And yeah, I think without further ado, Beth, go ahead and take it over.
Thanks, Lily, and thanks to those of you who joined today. We have a nice intimate group today, and so I invite you to, as Lily said, it certainly is easier if we keep our phones, our computers on mute, but that doesn't mean we don't want it to be participatory. So please do use that chat. Feel free to be on camera or off camera so that we can not only learn from my examples and experience, but from each other as well, because you each have experience to share. Today's topic is keep them coming back. How can we rethink volunteer retention, especially when we have in the sector, in the field of food pantries, helping to address food insecurity, there are a lot of individuals who want to serve episodically, just one time. And how can we really transform those one-time opportunities to more ongoing volunteer roles for individuals? One of the organizations that has done that very well and very thoughtfully is an organization called Care and Share for Southern Colorado. It is a widespread, large food organization that covers from basically Colorado Springs south in my home state here in Colorado. And a couple years back, they had the strategic challenge of increasing food distribution by 4 million pounds of food within a very short planning period, from about 20 million pounds to 25 million pounds of food within 3 years of their remaining 5-year plan. And they knew that they couldn't achieve the strategic goal without a significant increase in volunteers. And so they needed to figure out ways to build their capacity to have simultaneous shifts, to have shifts that perhaps were on off hours, not just Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 kind of thing. So it was a really big challenge for them to find a way to get staff to welcome volunteers during those time periods when volunteers wanted to volunteer, not necessarily those hours when staff were already staffing the offices. In order to achieve that, they developed a role, which you'll hear me referring to in one form or another during our time together today, called peer coordinators. Interestingly, I was working with the organization at the time to help them develop leadership roles for volunteers, and there was a reluctance to use the term leader. So they came up with the term peer coordinators. These volunteers arrived 30 minutes prior to the volunteer shift, set up and prepared the sorting area for the volunteer group, ensured that all the totes had the proper signage. They welcomed the volunteer group. They gave clear and concise instructions to each group so that the individuals knew what they were doing, and they answered questions about product, etc. They did a lot of other things, including 30 minutes prior to the end of the scheduled volunteer shift. They sort of organized the group cleaning and sorting of the area, performed the cleaning list, and ensured that the site was prepped for the next group or next shift coming in. They were able to tap emerging leaders to take on these peer coordinator roles. And in order to build support from their fellow staff members, they piloted just one evening a month first, just Thursday evenings, like the first Thursday evening of the month, so they could really demonstrate kind of the proof of concept One of the ways that they could expand volunteer opportunities was by having these off-hour shifts, and that volunteers would be capable of supervising and leading others. It wouldn't have to fall all to staff. With that proof of concept, they have been able to expand their capacity even further in subsequent years. As you'll see, this role of peer coordinator or volunteer leaders, like staff roles, can be really vital in transforming one-time volunteers to those that come back on a more regular or even episodic basis. So that's what we're going to chat about today. I'd love to hear from you all. Use the chat if you're comfortable. A little bit about what brought you to this topic today. Do you engage one-time volunteers and just have trouble getting them to come back? Are you not even at a point of allowing people to sign up just for a shift? You know, what brought you to this session on retaining volunteers? What's your pain point? What's your challenge? So while you're hopefully writing in the chat, I won't share names when I read out some of the well, I guess you'll be able to see each other's, but hopefully I'm tap dancing long enough that someone's going to share a little bit in the chat about what brought you here. I will share just a couple comments about data from the field. Research shows that while there is an increase in interest in short-term or one-time volunteering across the volunteerism landscape, we also know that people are more likely to come back if they have a positive experience. So one of the things we want to talk about today is making the first experience welcoming and successful and positive of an experience for these episodic volunteers. So unless someone's writing a whole novel here, I'm guessing everyone's a little reluctant to share. Ah, great, thank you. So we have one comment. One person is looking for better ways to keep volunteers longer. Some have to leave, but others just get bored and leave. So how to make it a better experience. Great, thank you for weighing in on that. I appreciate that. Hopefully I will tackle some of those in our planned content today. And if others have other needs or pain points, happy to have you add those to the chat throughout. So I mentioned that there are some trends in the volunteer landscape, in that volunteers are seeking shorter term volunteer opportunities, in that we see that while even in recent years, the volunteer rate has finally turned around and is very much on the rise in the US, we see simultaneous to that, the average hours any given volunteer is giving on average each year is plummeting. So while the volunteer rate in the United States rose between 2015 and 2017 from around 24-25% to over 30%, the number of hours that any given volunteer is contributing dropped from around 129 to like 80 something volunteer hours a year. But we also see other trends contributing to this short-term increase. We see a huge increase that's been going for a long time on student community service. There's also ongoingly court-ordered community service, which is, obviously time limited. There's a big rise in employee engagement and corporate volunteerism, which, while curtailed over the last year with COVID, is still very much a priority of corporate social responsibility folks. And then we have what I like to call free agent volunteers. We have individuals who are interested in service, motivated by service, but less inspired by the chance to affiliate with one particular organization ongoingly, and instead are interested in trying out different places and not being tied down. So kind of operating as a free agent. A couple years back, in light of some of these trends, or anticipating some of these trends, because this study was done in 2009, an organization in New York City called New York Cares did a landmark study on volunteer engagement, particularly around how to move people up the scale of engagement. And they deemed this this sort of ladder as the volunteer engagement scale. As part of this research, they looked at why do volunteers stay, and what keeps them not only coming back, but also moving up kind of the ladder of engagement. And I will kind of go off script for a moment and apologize for background noise. There is outside my third floor window, a man hanging out the window, cleaning the building at the moment. So hopefully that banging will end shortly. Thank you for your patience. So what did this study learn? And I'm going to share some more at the end as well about this study. But one of the things it determined was that volunteers stay engaged over time for the same reasons that they initially became involved, which is to help others, to make their communities a better place to live. The strongest factor in determining whether volunteers became more involved over time were the same as for volunteers who were already highly engaged. Basically, satisfaction with the organization and a belief that their work makes a difference. So that means not only is it on our shoulders to give them a positive experience, but also to articulate, share really clearly how their time with you makes a difference. What's that impact for the organization? Another New York-based organization with volunteers in cities throughout the US did a study a couple years later, about 5-6 years ago, I think it is, maybe longer, particularly looking at young adult volunteers. What transforms young adult episodic volunteers into ongoing? And they were surprised to see that for their programs, a significant majority of participants were returning, with more than a third participating 4 or more times. And what drove this repeated, deeper engagement for the participants were authenticity and the impact of the work itself, the opportunity to serve with others who care about the same things, and the chance to form meaningful relationships with people from the communities that were different from their own. For those of you in more rural areas, that may be more of a challenge, but I still think it's important to think about how can you build into your volunteer opportunities some of this social opportunity to engage with others who care about similar issues, hunger or food insecurity or economic insecurity in many of your cases, but also how can they connect with communities, if appropriate, being served. That may or may not work for your organization. I want to also share a tool now that we've kind of made the case that having a positive experience and doing authentic work and understanding the impact that a volunteer's time has on the community, that those are vital to keeping people coming back. I want to share a tool to help us think about how ready each of your organization is to engage volunteers in short-term opportunities, because that quality of experience is so vital. And we're going to spend really after this a lot of the time talking about how do you ensure that you have that good quality experience. But one place to start is to assess where are you now, kind of in terms of readiness to involve short-term volunteers. The Minnesota Association for Volunteer Administration, MAVA, it actually just changed its name, the Minnesota Alliance for Volunteer, I have to think about what the other A is, but it's still MAVA, had a tool that they developed a few years back, which I've adapted on the screen today. And it's essentially a readiness assessment that was part of an initiative of MAVA to address volunteers who were seeking short-term opportunities. So I'm going to read aloud, because they're a little small on the screen. I'm going to read aloud some of the statements here, and I'm then going to ask for you, I'm going to try and pull out some participation today, to weigh in on the chat about, how you think your organization might stack up. Are there areas where you have strengths and or what might be one area that you could start to make some changes to get yourself more ready to engage volunteers effectively in short-term roles? Because even if your goal is long-term engagement, having positive experiences on the short term is going to transform that into a stepping stone for more repeat engagement. So here are a couple of the elements that MAVA reports and their research indicates are important to have in place to a large degree to be successful. We have developed some volunteer position descriptions for short-term roles. We have an orientation and onboarding process for short-term roles. We provide staff training to think in new ways about volunteer time commitments and to work with some volunteers on short-term roles. We have developed a culture that accepts involving volunteers in short-term roles. We've given some thought to how to develop relationships with short-term volunteers. We have an online system for volunteers to self-schedule or some other means to help volunteers save time. And finally, do we have a sense of when to say yes or no as to what will work for a volunteer making a short-term commitment? So with that, hopefully you've kind of heard those, looked at them on the screen, and done a little mental checklist. Oh, we have that in place. We haven't done that. That'll be really tough for us, or we're really good on that area. So I'd love to see if we can get a few people to weigh in the chat and maybe share one area where you could perhaps make a start at shifting and increasing your readiness. What might be an area that you might want to tackle or might need to tackle first to increase your readiness to engage volunteers on the short term? And I'll pause for a moment and take a sip of tea and see if anyone is willing to weigh in on that. And again, I'll just note that, that the reason I know that a lot of the goals of coming to this webinar is about how to increase retention over the long term, but because we have this trend of individuals seeking shorter term engagements, one of the pathways to get people to stay longer is to widen the funnel and increase the number of opportunities that are short term, make that a positive experience, and get people to sign up kind of as serial volunteers, like I'll do this and then I'll come back again and then I'll come back again, rather than signing up for every Tuesday 1 to 5 for the rest of my life, or even just for the whole year. That is increasingly difficult to get people to register for. So thank you, Christina, for weighing in. Self-scheduling looks like something that is something that Christina her organization could benefit from. And that is vitally important to give volunteers the opportunity to be flexible and yet in control of their own time, and doesn't have to be expensive technology. There's a lot of great technology out there, and particularly around scheduling shifts. There are even free technologies, free platforms for self-scheduling. I certainly think that having a robust volunteer management system, like there are lots of them, so I'll just name a couple without recommending in particular, but Volgistics, Service, which is spelled CERVIS, Better Impact. There are a lot of different systems that all of which have self-scheduling, but there are also freebies as well for that. And Christina also noted that there is an idea for how you could put your schedules on portals, just have to get it worked out. So hopefully this will give you some inspiration. Thank you. Another piece that I think is really important before embarking on designing opportunities for short-term volunteers or figuring out how to structure them to maximize impact as well as your chances of getting them to come back for more is to consider, what is success? What is success when engaging in particular short-term volunteers? I always like to think about success measures according to three different arenas, let's say. For the beneficiaries, for the communities you serve, what are the outcomes or the outputs for a service day, for example? If you're serving meals, how many meals are going to be served? How many people served? How many pounds of food distributed or packaged and made ready for distribution? For your organization, for the pantry itself, would success be measured in raising awareness of food insecurity or of your organization as a whole? What about donations or corporate contributions? Number or percent of volunteers who return after one time? Is it leadership development? Is it recruitment of new volunteers? Success shouldn't be all of those things, but what are your priorities for your organization? And then, of course, what are your benefits for the volunteers themselves? Is it professional development for students or professionals? Is it a chance to make a difference? Or is it social connection or some combination thereof? So think about articulating what success is for your volunteer opportunities. Then you can begin to prepare for that success and structure the volunteer opportunity to increase that success. And finally, use that one-time volunteer opportunity as a bridge to future opportunities to increase the chances of people coming back. So we're going to unpack each of these. Let's start with preparing for success. When you have a service day or a project or even just a one-time shift for volunteers coming in, you want to make sure that you're thoughtful about designing the role, getting the right people on board, and of course, setting expectations so that there's a match between what the volunteers are seeking and expect and what you actually deliver on that day. So let's also take these apart one by one. I think that last time when we talked about recruiting volunteers, I'm sure that I talked to some length about my belief that a volunteer position description is essential. So as you design even short-term roles for volunteers, let's say you have a fundraiser and you need people to hand out water at a 5K run or welcome people to a fundraising event or a food drive, even working a food drive around holidays, it's vital to develop a position description. I can't stress enough how important taking the time to articulate, in particular, the key responsibilities and the impact and outcome of the role can be. If you can't articulate how the volunteer, even if they're only going to be there for 4 hours, what they're responsible for, not their list of duties, like come in, check in, move these boxes here, sort this, weigh that, not that, but for what things are they responsible, more generally speaking. And I'll share some examples. And then also the impact and outcome. As I did with success measures, I think that it's helpful to think about impacts and outcomes in 3 ways. What are the impacts and outcomes for beneficiaries, like meals provided, pounds of food distributed? For the organization, maybe it's saved staff time or increased brand awareness. And for the volunteer, him or herself, maybe it's learning new skills, being part of a high-functioning team, getting credit for school or continuing education. And being able to articulate these helps with recruitment and recognition. And it also helps you determine what you need to track in ensuring that you can meaningfully evaluate the effort and thank volunteers for their time, which is really vital when trying to engage them further. So I want to share an example from an organization here in Colorado. It's called 9 Health Fair. It's a statewide organization dedicated to providing free and low-cost health screenings and education throughout the state. They partner with organizations statewide who share their mission or value it, and then those partner organizations serve as host sites and as engagers of volunteers. So as an example, there is actually a host site a couple miles down the street from me that hosts its health fair every April. this year things were adapted, obviously, because of COVID. And they get, they're open from 7 a.m. to noon on their 1-day or half-day site health fair. They get 100 volunteers and about 500 individuals walk through the door to get health education and low-cost screening. And some volunteers are from within this house of worship, and others are from outside that community, especially the medical volunteers. And many of these medical volunteers, nurses, doctors, phlebotomists, come like serially. They show up at other health fairs as well. And in line with the research I've just shared, when they have a good experience, they say to their volunteer site director, Lynn, I'll volunteer for you anywhere. She builds a relationship with them and they keep coming back and will follow her to any site. So one of the things they do is that they are really clear about their volunteer roles, and they lead their recruitment with the impact that volunteers can have. So here are a couple of their recruitment messages. Do you want to make a difference in the health of your community? Do you want to help your family, friends, and neighbors access free and low-cost health screening and education? Do you have the skills? Do you have skills and time that you want to share to help your community? Those are great opportunities to lead with impact when they're recruiting. Then, as you kind of click through on their website, this is all about setting expectations and designing roles. Even though the session isn't technically about recruitment, it's about retention, it starts with expectation setting. So we see these examples, and I will gladly share a PDF of the slides with Lily, and she can send them out afterwards. But here's a couple examples where, again, they're getting a highlight of the type of impact they can have and the type of work they might do. So as a bilingual volunteer, we have increasing need for people who are fluent in more than one language, helping out on the hotlines, filling volunteer roles throughout the day of a fair, doing outreach in diverse communities. If you're bilingual, we'd love your help. For non-medical and medical coordinators, help recruit volunteers and assist the leadership team to plan a health fair in your community. And I love that they are up front here saying, this is a major volunteer role with every fair. So it may be short term, but it is still a big role over those few months of preparation and implementation. So hopefully these will kind of give you a sense of how to not only structure roles meaningfully, but also to advertise them in a way that really sets people up to expect to understand the type of work they might do and the difference that they make. And I'm trying to multitask here, and I see that there have been some amazing comments by Yazaida, in that actually being in a rural community and a new food pantry, that they are incredibly blessed to have too many volunteers, and that it's sometimes hard to send people home since everyone wants to help and are so motivated, which is phenomenal. And I agree with Lily. Keep up the great work, and think about leadership roles, just as Lily mentioned, as well as perhaps some other ways that volunteers could help behind the scenes in your organization to build staff capacity, which is always a great blessing, a great position to be in. Not everyone is as lucky as Yazaida is to have so many people coming, but whether you have a blessing of abundance or a challenge of scarcity of having individuals, I still think it's really important to ensure that you think about which volunteers are qualified and appropriate for the different roles. In many food pantries, the roles tend to be manual labor and may or may not require very specific skills. But you may have roles, especially if you develop leadership roles or client intake roles, for example, that are very skills-based. So it's important to ensure that you have the right fit. Here's what 9 Health Fair did to ensure that they have qualified candidates at all of those health fairs, even if they're only showing up for 1 fair a year. They considered all of these questions and ensured that volunteers answered them in the online forms, and they checked to make sure that every volunteer candidate understood these expectations before being accepted into the volunteer role. So, identifying criteria and requirements. That's things like, are there physical demands? Are there time requirements? Is there an age minimum? Do people need to have signatures of signing on waivers or liability forms? On the application, can you ask volunteers to apply, or are you getting a group that needs to apply and sign a collective waiver? What about screening? Do you need to incorporate background checks or conduct interviews? Every volunteer role should have a screening process that is appropriate to the level of risk and responsibility for the role. So if volunteers will be in contact with vulnerable populations, then it's quite possible that it would be appropriate for them to have background checks. If, however, they're working behind the scenes or under the supervision of someone with a background check, they may not need to have that type of screening. If you're working with partner organizations, churches, service groups, companies, can you ask that organization to ensure compliance with all of the requirements? And share suggested language about that as well. Put them on waivers, etc. And finally, can you ensure that the volunteers are assigned on the day of only to stations that meet their abilities? So if that means pre-assigning or pre-screening, that might be really important to think about and to put into place. Another thing 9 Health Fair does ongoingly is that they ensure that they set expectations through not only recruitment, but through orientation. Orientations are all about expectation setting. And again, you might be sitting here saying, I thought this webinar was about retention, but given that all the research points to the fact that people come back when they had a positive experiences are built by having expectations being met or exceeded. So it's really important that we set appropriate expectations. So how do we set expectations through orientations for short-term volunteers? We certainly want to include organizational information. How does this work fit into the mission of your organization overall and community needs? What's the context for the work? Who's the team that they're going to be working with? Will it be led by volunteers or will it be led by staff? The paid or unpaid doesn't really matter, but who's their contact person when they show up? What can they expect in terms of policies and scheduling and processes? Are there safety things that they need to comply with? Do they need closed-toe shoes? Do they need, for COVID, are there any things that are really opening up, but were there other safety expectations around COVID-19? Are you going to be doing temperature checks or require masks or not? And then what else? What would they need access to? Your handbook with policies, other waivers, et cetera, that they need to sign. You can provide orientations in a lot of different ways. You can do it online, you can do it in writing, you could do it in person, or any combination thereof. If you do them online, it's the most convenient. It could be recorded or, even linked to YouTube or just some written material online. But it's the least personal when it's done online. In writing, you can send materials, but you're least able to reinforce that. And in person is really nice for meeting people, but it's not so convenient if you're requiring short-term volunteers to come in extra time, right? So I'll share, again, examples from this case study of 9 Health Fair. They provide a number of orientations and training videos online. For many day of volunteers, they can see videos online like this ambassador training guideline on how to help with online registration, to specialty training for nurses, like the phlebotomy protocols, operating centrifuges. That's not just for any volunteer, that's for people who trained in taking blood. One of the things that I find really exciting is that 9 Health Fair makes these available to anyone. It's not behind a big login portal on their website. Anyone can see them, which means they also work for recruitment for someone who might be interested in getting a taste of what a 9 Health Fair volunteer might expect by way of training and support, which, as evidenced by this, is a lot of training and support. So that's a little bit about preparing and setting expectations. We also want to structure the day and bridge to future opportunities. But I'll take a moment and just see if there are any questions or comments anyone wants to share. I will have time at the end, but I'll just pause and see if there are comments or additional ideas for preparing and preparing the role before we move on to how you can structure the volunteer experience on the day of. Okay. Well, as I've mentioned and highlighted, research shows that quality of experience is really vital when volunteers are surveyed about their experience in days of service. That really, the quality of the day is directly correlated to whether or not they come back. So let's talk about 2 elements of this: structuring the day and bridging to future opportunities, so that every participant leaves with an understanding of how else they could be involved. I'm going to switch to a different type of food-related organization and share a case study about Kayam Farm, which is in Maryland, and it's an experiential education organization grounded in Judaism, in agriculture and ecology, and it offers lots of different opportunities for engagement, depending on the age of family members and the amount of time they can offer. Their events range from single-day events to an interfaith farm school in which families commit to a 6 to 8 week program. And one of the reasons that I wanted to bring up Kayam Farm is that not only do they deal with food production and food resources and the environment, but like many food pantries, they're one of the relatively few types of organizations that can accept and leverage family volunteers. And over the last 10, 15 years, family volunteering, the demand for family volunteer opportunities continues to rise. And I'd welcome anyone on this call to weigh in and share any ways you engage families together as volunteers, because again, there's only, of all my clients, there's only, and not just my clients, but people I know in the, across the US, there are very few nonprofits that are set up to be able to do that. So, so one of the motivations for Kayam Farm to develop a program, they have these kind of service days, and their goals for doing that were threefold. They wanted to address the increased demand in having volunteers come for one-time volunteer opportunities. There are groups that reach out, individuals in their community CSAs, their agriculture groups, and so they were getting all these increased requests for people to come just once, especially by families. And so they wanted to find a way to kind of corral that into specific events, days set aside for family service days. They also wanted to expose people to the farm so that they could potentially cultivate longer term volunteers. So they created these one-off family service days, family farm days, with the specific goal that success would be measured in how many people, at least in part, how many people then decided to sign up for more regular volunteer opportunities. And they wanted to build community and do some community education because they incorporated some of their education programs into the day. So when I asked their volunteer coordinator, what would be your advice on achieving those goals with a family volunteer program if others were thinking about doing that? And here's what she suggested, and I think this advice holds true for any type of organization. First, she said, and I loved this phrase, create a container for volunteers. Know what your volunteers are coming to do. Create appropriate activities that will keep them engaged and that are kid parent friendly. We don't want to give them a task of building a chicken coop and then, kind of that typical stereotypical dad might take over and the kids aren't really interested. So if there's a planting going on, it's a great thing to have kids and families do together and give guidance about which pieces the adult can do and which the kids could do. It really reminds me I started my career in museums and particularly interested in family education. And there are labels in certain museums that are specifically for parents to give them guidance on what to ask or how to engage their children in the learning. And it's very similar at this event. Christina weighed in the chat here about the challenges of having families help because sometimes they had kids running the food bank. Let me just read this verbatim. We've had the parents take their teenage kids for the grocery rescue pickups at stores. We've had them pack food bags, and we've just started having them cover an afternoon running the food bank. Ironically, all of these situations were one parent with two teens, but it sounds like it might be different groups of, different groupings of parents with two teens. So I love hearing that. When I mentioned I started in museums, we would have the way that we engaged teens and children over 8, I think it was that we would basically say any child and any adult responsible for the child would be considered a family pair, and together they filled one shift. So, so we would build those shifts so that if they were interpreting on the floor, they would be doing that together, whether it was in the front or kind of back of the house behind the scenes. So another piece of advice that they gave at CIAM was to recommend developing a very clear liability contract and to carefully schedule volunteer opportunities so that families have a chance to meet each other. They schedule so that they're sure to have staff support and so that families can meet other families and create a community. And finally, a spectrum of activities was important. They try to offer a variety of options that appeal to levels of commitment, time availability, and skills. And they knew that success wasn't being measured by having 100% of those one-time volunteers coming back, but having a certain percentage, maybe even just 20%, return for future volunteer opportunities. But they were raising awareness and education levels, and there were ways to measure that among their participants as well. The last piece I want to talk about before we open it up for questions is the importance of being really intentional about bridging to future volunteer opportunities. You want to do that by having a list of opportunities that all of your frontline staff, and that could be volunteers or paid staff, has at their kind of fingertips. And also engaging volunteers as talent scouts, and finally being intentional about following up. So before engaging volunteers in these one-time events or just one-time shifts, even if they're regular shifts, but you make it available for self-scheduling for one-times, you want to think about what are the future opportunities? What else do you need volunteers to do? What other areas are you prioritizing recruitment for? And think about with whom you want to share that list. If the volunteer leader, the volunteer coordinator, the executive director is the only one who knows those opportunities, but isn't the one interacting with the volunteers, then it doesn't do any good, right? We need to know that the people who are face-to-face with the event volunteers or with the short-term volunteers knows what's kind of in your back pocket, what you're trying to fill. And do they know what you're looking for in other volunteers? You want to train your frontline team to know this information. And only then are they really also serving as talent scouts. You want to pass that baton, take the responsibility off your shoulders and share it with lead volunteers or other staff who can serve as talent scouts on behalf of your food pantry. So you could do that in a lot of different roles. You could have team leads or peer coordinators like the ones I talked about for Care and Share Food Bank for Southern Colorado. They lead teams of volunteers on a day of service, and I'll share another example of that in a moment. I worked with an outdoor, it was a museum, a living history museum in New Hampshire, where they have an annual festival of arts, and they had a volunteer role. I love the name. They deemed this individual the detail wrangler. And while on the surface, that volunteer is there to keep things moving smoothly and check in across all the arts, books, etc., they also are there to chat it up with the volunteers and take note of who are the rising stars among those volunteers so that they can circle back and let the leadership know that there are potential volunteers that should be tapped for ongoing roles at the organization. So here's a case study of an organization also from New Hampshire called Families in Transition. And Families in Transition, or FIT, is an organization that helps move individuals from homelessness to a more stable living situation. And they have a number of residential facilities, but that's not where the volunteers serve. The volunteers serve in their fundraising storefronts called, they're resale shops, and they're called outfitters, and they take the FIT from Families in Transition, FIT. So these outfitters stores raise funds for families in transition by selling donated goods to the public. And so they have volunteers at outfitters, and yet they were very disconnected from the impact of their work because they weren't working with homeless populations, they were selling clothes. And they also had challenges in that they had an increased demand for volunteer groups, but it took a lot of staff time to manage these groups. So they piloted a program where they developed leadership volunteers who welcome and onboard and supervise and even offboard these groups of volunteers. And they did so, they needed some additional support, things like a dedicated space, which you can see in the picture here. They shared impact statements in the volunteer lounge that let all the volunteers get a sense of the type of impact that they have collectively on the organization. And then they also really communicated very strategically the impact. And I said that one of the things that keeps people coming back is if they understand the impact that they're having. So these leadership volunteers in a single year were able to increase the capacity of Families in Transition to accept volunteers from 5,000 hours in a single year to 12,000 hours in a single year. And that's a really big increase, more than doubling the amount of volunteers and volunteer contributions that they could accept because they built their staff capacity to be able to manage more volunteers. So for those of you who have an abundance of volunteers and may need to be turning them away, you might be able to leverage volunteer leaders to help build staff capacity if you have the space and the need to be able to build your capacity to really engage more people. Then they also translated those increased hours, not just to increase in hours and not just to financial value. They said the financial value of that more than doubling of volunteer hours is the equivalent of housing 31 families for an entire year. And that really brings the impact into kind of the heart of their mission, which is housing families. So I challenge you to think beyond just hours as measures of success, but also to think about how can you communicate the impact volunteers have in terms of your outcomes, your mission work. That's what will drive people to come back. And the last piece I want to share, just kind of teasing out this team leader role, is that, if you recall at the start of the webinar, I shared a bit about a study done in New York by New York Cares around volunteer team leaders and the volunteer engagement scale. And one of the things they learned is that at New York Cares, team leaders are really, really vital to implementing their volunteer projects, whether they be renovating homes or handling food drives or distributing food or any other type of program projects that they do. But one of the things that they learned in this study is that the team leader may have unwittingly been contributing to decreased volunteer retention because they tended almost entirely in getting the job done. And you might be saying, did I hear that right? Did Beth really say that volunteers may have been, volunteer leaders, project leaders may have actually been contributing to decreased retention because they were focusing on actually doing their job? And the answer is yes. And it was just as surprising to New York Cares when they learned this. What could explain it? It's that the team leaders were serving as managers focused solely on the nuts and bolts of the project at hand, rather than as leaders who could inspire other volunteers to deepen their commitment to New York Cares and the organizations they were partnering with and to volunteering. So with all these factors, New York Cares developed or revised their leadership development program that focused on leveraging team leaders' commitment by kind of redefining their position description and saying, in addition to being responsible for getting the job done, they were responsible for getting to know the volunteers, calling them in advance, letting them know they're looking forward to meeting them, talking with them about the work of New York Cares while they were on the job, and thanking them and following up afterwards. And basically by redesigning, refining the volunteer team leader position description to include as one of their key responsibilities nurturing lasting relationships with the volunteers, they were able to turn that trend around. And now volunteer leaders are vital to increasing retention and moving people up that volunteer, moving up that volunteer engagement scale. So I'll just wrap up with a couple key points about following up, which is really important. Following up is vital to bridging to new volunteer opportunities, just as I noted with the New York Cares project leaders. Whether it's emails with a thank you and links to new volunteer opportunities, or phone calls and more personal follow-up, it's really vital that, that we build in follow-up opportunities. Another organization, I think I talked about it last time potentially, that had engaged young volunteers for a one-time opportunity to do speaking engagements, to be on a panel for children aging out of the foster system to be ready to enter the work field. They were asked to do one thing, which was be on a panel, but then there were other people from that board who followed up with those volunteers and had coffee with them and said, now you know about our mission, how might you be able to get involved? And for food pantry shifts, you may not have the capacity or need to have individual coffees with people, but what's your version of that, right? What's the follow-up? Is it a phone call? Is it a personalized email? So that people know that they were seen, they were gotten, they were known, they'd become known to the organization, and that their skills would be welcome contributions ongoingly. So plan for follow-up, identify who is going to do the follow-up. Is it the volunteers who are at the event, the team leaders, or is it staff? Make it easy and agree to timelines so that this important information doesn't fall through the cracks. And finally, think about how you'll measure impact. I've kind of talked about that throughout. All of these on the screen are different ways to measure, but are you sharing this with your event volunteers, with their community partners who bring the groups? Knowing that they made a difference is really a key motivator for volunteers. So you want to be able to understand and share with them how their 2 or 4 hours is part of something bigger. That's how we make it motivating to come back. The handout that Lily is going to share with you is a checklist to help you go through all of these pieces, whether they're for special events or for your ongoing shifts. How can you incorporate some of these considerations into the design of your volunteer experiences? And when you do that, you will be better positioned to have your volunteers even shift from one time to repeat, or from repeat to truly ongoing and committed volunteers. You're not going to get them all. Not everyone wants to sign up for regular shifts, but you can move the needle by instituting some of these best practices. So with that, I'm going to just let Lily weigh in on some of the upcoming opportunities, and then we'll leave a couple other moments for questions. But Lily, do you want to, while people might be thinking about their questions, do you want to share a little bit about what's coming next in our series?
Yeah, thank you so much, Beth. So next week we have a volunteer management training 101, where actually someone who works at St. Mary's will be talking to us about, once we get the volunteers in the door, what are some specific trainings that volunteers need to be trained on and would make them feel prepared and not blindsided when they're coming for their first shift. And then of course, one last time we have Beth again, June 22nd, and I'll go ahead and let her explain that. But just to mention, we are in the process of making July and August trainings. I'm very, very excited for them. We're going to have some animated videos, live Q&A, meet and greet with other agencies like yourselves, and maybe even a tour around a food pantry's special event day that they put on to fundraise. So very excited for the next couple trainings next few months. So stay tuned for those.
And on June 22nd, I'll be demystifying the sticky situations, right? We all have challenging situations with volunteers or fellow staff members. So I'll be sharing a framework to help you navigate sticky situations, and you are welcome to come with your own sticky situation, which we're not going to use any names or anything, but you're welcome to come and see how this framework can be applied, or come with some hypothetical ones, and that'll work. In the meantime, so I look forward to that one. And in the meantime, we have a couple more minutes. I'm open to staying to talk about questions or any other ideas that you want to share with some of your colleagues. So we will monitor the chat for another moment or two. Thank you to everyone who's weighing in with thank yous and letting us know they need to shift gears, but we'll just give it a moment or two of wait time and see if any questions pop up before we wrap up for the afternoon. Lily?
While we're waiting for questions, I have a question.
Sure.
Throughout your work and through what you've researched, what are the best strategies to appreciate volunteers? Is it luncheons? Is it personal cards? Is it calling them? What have you found to be the best way to appreciate the volunteers that keep coming back and to ensure that they continue?
Yeah, recognition. I'd say there's probably three things in brief. One is having some sort of personalized recognition, which doesn't have to be, it doesn't mean this person gets this gift and this person gets that gift, but, ensuring that there is some form of recognition and acknowledging that for many, especially younger volunteers, and by younger, I mean, even people in their 50s and younger, big banquets and things are less motivating for people today. So, a gift card to a coffee shop or a tea shop, if someone likes that, or just a thank you, any of those, it doesn't have to cost much. So that's one. Two, create a culture of appreciation where volunteers' names are known and people are thanked on a regular basis. That's much more important than an annual event from all of our research. And third, measure and communicate the impact that people have. So it ties in with today. Understanding the difference that they made is mostly what motivates volunteers to feel appreciated and to come back.